The ruling came quietly, but its impact is anything but subtle. In the early hours of a tense political moment, a federal appeals court stepped in and altered the balance of power between Washington and a state already on edge. For weeks, federal immigration agents operating in Minnesota had been constrained by a lower court order that limited how they could engage with demonstrators and observers. Now, with a single judicial decision, those constraints have been lifted, at least temporarily. The question is not just what this ruling allows federal agents to do, but what it reveals about authority, constitutional boundaries, and the direction of federal-state relations in an era of deep political fracture. The article published by Fox News centers on a legal victory for the Trump administration after the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals paused a district court injunction that had restricted federal immigration agents during enforcement operations in Minnesota. The original injunction had been issued in response to a lawsuit from the state, which argued that federal actions during recent operations crossed constitutional lines and interfered with lawful public expression and oversight. By staying that injunction, the appeals court restored broader operational discretion to federal agents while the underlying legal dispute continues. At its core, this case is not simply about immigration enforcement tactics. It is about who gets to define the limits of power when federal authority intersects with public dissent and state resistance. Minnesota's lawsuit emerged after a period of intense confrontation between federal agents and local communities, during which state officials claimed that federal personnel were acting beyond acceptable legal boundaries. The district court initially agreed, imposing limits designed to prevent retaliation against individuals who were observing or expressing opposition during enforcement actions. That decision was framed as a necessary safeguard for constitutional protections. The Trump administration immediately challenged the ruling, arguing that it represented a dangerous precedent. From the administration's perspective, the district court had overstepped by imposing operational rules on federal agents tasked with enforcing national law. Justice Department attorneys contended that such restrictions could hinder agents' ability to perform their duties safely and effectively, particularly in dynamic environments where large crowds and heightened emotions were present. They warned that allowing a single district judge to dictate how federal agents operate could invite similar challenges across the country, fragmenting federal authority. The appeals court did not rule on the merits of the case itself. Instead, it issued a stay, effectively freezing the lower court's injunction while the appeal proceeds. This procedural move carries significant consequences. By suspending the restrictions, the court restored the status quo that existed before the injunction, granting federal agents wider latitude in how they manage enforcement operations and interact with demonstrators. The decision signals a judicial inclination to avoid immediate constraints on federal power while larger constitutional questions are examined. This development must be understood within the broader political and legal environment surrounding federal enforcement in Minnesota. The state has positioned itself as a vocal critic of the Trump administration's approach, particularly in urban areas where federal operations have drawn public attention and opposition. State leaders have accused federal agencies of operating with insufficient transparency and disregard for local concerns. The lawsuit that led to the original injunction was part of a broader effort to assert state oversight and protect residents' rights during federal actions. For supporters of the appeals court decision, the ruling is a reaffirmation of federal supremacy in matters of national law. They argue that immigration enforcement is a federal responsibility and that states cannot impose ad hoc limitations based on political disagreement. From this viewpoint, the district court's injunction was less about protecting rights and more about obstructing lawful federal activity. The appeals court's stay is seen as a necessary corrective, preventing state officials from using the courts to undermine federal objectives. Critics, however, view the ruling as a troubling retreat from judicial oversight. They argue that the original injunction was a response to specific alleged misconduct, not an attempt to nullify federal authority. By lifting the restrictions, they say, the appeals court has allowed potentially problematic practices to resume without resolving the underlying constitutional concerns. For these critics, the decision reinforces a perception that federal agencies are insulated from accountability when their actions collide with public expression and scrutiny. The legal arguments on both sides revolve around familiar constitutional principles, but their application in this context is unusually charged. The state's case emphasizes protections for expression and assembly, asserting that individuals should be able to observe and document federal actions without fear of reprisal. The federal government counters that such observations can blur into interference, particularly during active operations. Determining where observation ends and obstruction begins is a central challenge in the case, and one that courts have struggled with in various contexts. What makes this dispute particularly significant is its potential to shape future interactions between federal agents and the public nationwide. If the appeals court ultimately sides with the administration, it could limit the ability of states to impose judicial checks on federal enforcement conduct, even when state officials believe constitutional lines are being tested. Conversely, if the injunction is reinstated or upheld in some form, it could embolden other states to seek similar limits, reshaping how federal agencies operate in contested environments. The Fox News article frames the ruling as a clear victory for the Trump administration, and in practical terms, that assessment is accurate. The stay allows federal agents to proceed without the constraints imposed by the district court, at least for now. But the deeper significance lies in the unresolved questions that remain. The appeals court has not endorsed the administration's position outright. It has simply chosen not to enforce the restrictions while the case moves forward. The final outcome could still alter the landscape. Politically, the ruling feeds into an already polarized national conversation. Supporters of the administration are likely to interpret the decision as validation of their view that federal authority has been unfairly challenged by partisan state officials. Opponents may see it as another example of federal power being prioritized over local concerns and individual rights. This divergence in interpretation underscores how legal decisions increasingly serve as symbolic markers in broader political struggles. There is also an institutional dimension to consider. Courts are often reluctant to intervene deeply in the day-to-day operations of federal agencies, particularly in areas tied to national policy. The appeals court's stay may reflect that institutional caution rather than a definitive judgment on the merits. By preserving federal discretion during the appeal, the court avoids setting an immediate precedent that could ripple across jurisdictions. Looking ahead, the case is far from over. The appeals process will involve detailed examination of the factual record, legal standards, and constitutional claims raised by both sides. Depending on the outcome, the dispute could reach the Supreme Court, especially if it is seen as raising fundamental questions about federal authority and state resistance. Until then, the practical reality on the ground in Minnesota has shifted back in favor of federal agencies. In the meantime, the ruling sends a message that extends beyond the courtroom. It signals that challenges to federal enforcement will face significant hurdles even when framed around constitutional concerns. At the same time, it leaves open the possibility that those concerns may eventually find judicial recognition. This tension between immediate authority and long-term accountability defines much of the current legal landscape. Ultimately, the significance of this case lies not only in what it allows federal agents to do today, but in how it shapes the evolving relationship between national power, state oversight, and public scrutiny. The appeals court decision restores federal latitude, but it does not resolve the deeper debate over limits and legitimacy. As the legal process continues, the outcome will help determine whether this episode is remembered as a temporary procedural shift or a lasting redefinition of federal-state boundaries. For now, one thing is clear. The courtroom has become another front in a wider struggle over authority, rights, and the role of government in contested public spaces. The ruling may have paused one set of restrictions, but it has intensified a conversation that is far from settled.